Well, one of the stories that I was reading about in your rememoir, before I
That's
forget,
what I'm talking about. Yeah.
it's on page 180. There's actually two vignettes here regarding a man by the name of David Frost, who has a show that I've never heard of David Frost, but you can tell us about him. But it's a time when you actually got drunk unintentionally on live TV. So
Yes,
this is a very fascinating story. Can you tell us
of course.
what happened?
I'll tell you the story that I remember very clearly. Incidentally, just so you're aware of it, David Frost, I'm going back to, I guess, the late 60s and the early 70s, was a very important name.
Hmm.
He had his own television show. He's from England. He's English.
Oh, okay.
He had an important 1 hour television show here in America, and he had the same show in England, in London. He used to fly back and forth
Oh,
doing the two shows. He at one time had one of the most important TV interviews with Richard Nixon.
oh, wow.
When Richard Nixon was president, going through this whole thing with impeachment and all that kind of stuff. So David Frost was very popular, and we became fairly good friends. What happened with that particular show you're talking about? All right, I was doing a trade show for U.S. Steel in Detroit, Michigan at Cobo Hall. In those years, I was doing a lot of trade shows for U.S. As a matter of fact, that was one thing I looked up. And for Litton Industries, a lot of big, I don't know if you can see that, but that's Litton Industries. What I used to do is they would give me, see, on one side, I had all the states, the 50 states of America, their capital cities and their populations, which I used to demonstrate. But I said most important is your information, your company information. So I would do 50 on the other side with three things. So that when I was doing this, when these things, all the people around my area had one of these, because somebody handed it out, they would yell out a number, and I would tell them the city, the state at that number, the capital city and the population, but I'd say most important, number 15 on the other side is U.S. Steel, so-and-so, and so-and-so. That was the whole point, to get the company in. So this was Litton Industry, this is U.S. Steel, the same thing, okay? The reason I mentioned that, I was in Detroit at Cobo Hall, and I got a call from David Frost. How he knew where I was, I don't remember, but he knew I was there, and he contacted me. And he said, okay, again, let me explain it. There were 6 pamphlets called The Bluffer's Guide. Mm-hmm. They were pretty thick pamphlets. And the whole point of these is if you read them, it would make you look, that was what they meant by bluffers, it would make you look like one of the most knowledgeable people of that particular subject. And there were some important subjects. Let's see if my memory is working. Cinema, the history of cinema, I guess. Art, literature, music, wine. I know wine. You'll see why in a minute. Wine and opera. Those were the 6.
You got all of them.
Okay, the mind is still working a little bit, not the way it used to, believe me. Anyway, he said, Harry, what happened, the point of this is David Frost had written the introductions to each one of these pamphlets. So that's how he was involved. Whether he was making money from the sale of them or what, I don't know. But he said they want to better the sales of these pamphlets, and that I would help if I would pick any one of them and come on his show, which is very important, because one of the issues here was, this could make you very knowledgeable in one of those subjects if you remembered what you read. If you didn't remember it, what the heck is the point? Well, so he said, Harry, if you would pick one of them, I want to put you on a show, we'll talk about it in your show, how important it is, plus that you remember it, blah, blah, blah. So I said, fine. Long story short, I don't know much about any of those 6 subjects, really. but the one I thought I knew a little bit more about was wine.
Mhm.
So I picked wine. I mean, to me, it didn't make any difference. Because one of the little off sides of that, when I read all this pamphlet, because he had a messenger deliver the 6 pamphlets when he told me this, and I picked wine. When I started to read it after I told him I would read wine, well, I got to tell you, the things they talked about wine, I never heard the words they were using. I mean, I didn't know there was so much to know about wine.
Pretty
I
much
mean,
every
I
word
never
that
heard.
you talk about there, you talk about dropping words and concepts like crew.
Crew.
I
I,
had never
I
heard
didn't know. Had no idea what they meant. I still don't. You know, I knew a little bit more then at that time. But when I originally read what you just said, I'd never heard these words. I had no concept. Anyway, it was too late. I had picked wine. So now, again, long story short, I'm on the show, and he's got a wine expert on the show with me. That was the whole point, that I could fool the expert, which I did. I kept dropping words you can't believe. And this guy was so impressed, the wine expert, so impressed with me, how knowledgeable I was. I had no idea what I was talking about, but I was able to put it in the right area, et cetera, et cetera. But then what happened, and David Frost had never mentioned this to me, while we're talking, a waiter, a man dressed like a waiter, comes out with a pushcart with about 9 or 10 bottles of wine, full bottles of wine and glasses and buckets, all kind of a big thing, took up a big part of the stage. And I looked at David Frost, and he looked back at me, gave me he gave the attitude was like, do the best you can. Okay, so the whole point was we were going to taste wine. That's the point.
Hmm.
I'm not a wine taster. I always kid with my son. He has a different wine whenever I go there for dinner. And he says, I hope you're going to like this, Dad. And my remark is always the same. After the third sip, I couldn't care less, right? So
now,
anyway.
Covered. It's important to know they were covered, so you weren't supposed to know what label, what kind of wine it was. It was a blind.
I had no idea.
Okay, blind taste test.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't have mattered if there was a name. I don't know, one wine from the other. I was very young, naive, and read stupid. I didn't know about wine tasting. You know what? It's the most important thing. The most important thing is there were buckets there. You were supposed to taste the wine and then spit it out into the bucket. I didn't know that. I liked the taste. So that was the problem. I swallowed each taste.
Oh my God.
So I would say important things that I read in this silly pamphlet. I would go, yeah, the crew, etc., whatever. But I swallowed each swallow of these different wines, and by the 9th or 10th taste, forget about it. I was drunk. And what happened it wasn't a big deal, because this was the end of the show, and David Frost said something to say goodnight, and everybody got up to leave except me. I wasn't that drunk. I knew that if I stood up, I was going to fall down. So I just sat to my seat and went off the air. And afterwards, they came and picked me up, brought me some water or something, Wow. So that's that part of the silly story. The other part, I think that's in the book. I think that's what you mentioned, was David Frost's last show.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely image of how you were able to help him close that show. I like it. I wish there was video of it. There must be video, I imagine, somewhere. But...
Boy, I hope so, because it was a very strong thing. At least they told me. And it was all ad lib. Let me tell you the story.
Yeah.
It was the last show. David said to me, we're going to close with you, Harry, and we want you to, we will give you all the time you need before the show, because I want you to know everybody in the audience. In other words, the whole point was they wanted an empty studio at the end. So I had to remember everybody, because the point was, instead of telling the audience that I have stand up always, telling them to sit down as I called their name, now I told them to leave the studio when I called their name. That was the point. Okay? So, like I said, David and the producers, whatever, wanted an empty studio, but he said good night / goodbye. Okay? Well, okay, I remembered everybody, obviously, which I did anyway. And then when the time came at the very end of the show, I told the people to please after they all stood up as I called their names to please leave. I had to be a little careful here because I had to call the names of the people sitting at the ends of the aisles. Because if I called somebody in the middle, they'd have to step over people to get out. So I had to be careful there to make it easy for people to leave, which I could do. I knew the names anyway, you know. So I simply kept doing the ends of the aisles.
Wow.
And finally, I waited till I got to near the rear exit when I called the last couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith or whatever, and they left. And then what happened? God, I think of it now, my heart skips a beat because it did then. Nobody realized that I, of course, and everybody else, my MCs, my television people, when I called the last people of the 400, 500 people I met, there were cheers and screams and applause. All of a sudden, I called the last person, and it's dead silence.
Wow.
There's nobody left in the studio, right? They all left. We never thought of that. I'm telling you, my heart skipped a beat. But fortunately, I'm not getting wood mentally. I am or was pretty good at these kind of situations. Like I say, my heart did skip a beat. I'm sure my eyes rolled in my head a little bit, but then I looked at David Frost. I said, I'm Harry Lorraine. You're David Frost. Let's get the hell out of here. And I put my arm around his shoulder, and he put his arm around mine, and we walked out with the camera shooting our backs, walking out. That was the end of the show. Wow. When we got off the air, David Frost literally threw his arms around me. He said, Harry, that was probably one of the best closings of a show ever.